Thank you.
So, have you ever been introduced like that before, Mark?
I have not.
Well, we're delighted you're here. Thank you so much. The demands on your time, I can just only imagine, are extraordinary. What with the regulatory climate we're in right now, the banking and financial sector, not just B of A, but everybody, there's just intense scrutiny on that world. So thanks for taking the time to come do this.
It's great to be here.
So we met a few years ago. There was a group, I think it was the Believers in Business Conference, wasn't it? There was actually something I started when I was up at Yale, and it's wonderful to see the Yale School of Management students have continued it. It's initially was for the Ivy League, MBA crowd who got together to talk about what does faith and work have to do. It's sort of a mini version of what we do. And then they opened it up to the whole country, and now they get sort of routinely 400 or 500 people a year coming to do it. It's all student-led, and they invite in different executives like Mark and others, and to come and share their stories. So we kind of clicked, and I loved your story. So delighted you're with us. As you may know Mark's bio and background, just an exceptional career currently as the CFO Risk Executive, if I got the title right. He's been the treasurer for Bank of America. He also has sat on the boards of DTTC and BlackRock, starting though your roots as in the trading arena. Is that right?
Yes.
So you know really what's going on in those black boxes.
I do. Well, not always. I shouldn't have said that. I'm on film.
So before we talk about some work things, I think people would like to just get to know Mark the person. I asked you a question once, and I'll ask you again maybe as a way to start our conversation. We all have our nice polished little bios that the communications department or someone puts together. But tell us something that's not on your bio that's a window into your story.
I'll tell you the same thing I told you last time, and I had forgotten all about this till you mentioned last night. We were talking. I coached a college basketball team.
Yeah, but where?
In Liberia, Africa. My father taught in a college in Africa, Bible college in Africa, and I took a semester off college and went out and coached the basketball team. It was really a life-changing experience for me. Both from a chance to coaching was a great it was a great responsibility. I was coaching people I was 20 years old, coaching probably 30-year-old players, but also it just showed me how just what opportunity we have in the U.S. and to take advantage. We need to take advantage of that opportunity. And for these guys to go to college was just amazing. And for me, I'd always taken it for granted. So it was a great life-changing experience for me.
If you look back at that now, can you think of a dimension of it or an event that happened that has shaped your leadership style subconsciously, I'm sure?
Actually, it was interesting. I mean, from a leadership style, definitely yes. And they had this rule that seniors didn't have to take a PE class, and everybody else did at this college. And
now, people may not know what a PE class is anymore. The world has changed.
Physical education.
All right, gym class.
A gym class. And so part of your gym class was if you played a sport that counted. My best two players were seniors, and they didn't have to come to practice if they didn't want to. And one of them decided he didn't want to come to practice, and I pulled the team together, and I guess we were in front of the team, and I looked at him and I said, you either decide you're on the team or you're not. And luckily the other guy was probably the hardest working person in the college. He was on work scholarship. He was known as the hardest worker, straight A student, and practice, he was your model, everything. And I said, this guy is working, studying into deep in the night. He shows up to practice every day. You can show up. It's your choice. And I said, you walk out the door and you're done. And he walked out the door. And he was the best player. He was probably the best player on the team.
Wow.
And the team was shocked, And we ended up, our last game was against the biggest rival.
So you're without the star player.
Another college without the star player, and we'd never beat him, and we actually beat him. But it was it kind of brought the whole team together, and But it also showed me there's times when you just have to stand up and say, this is the rule, and you can't, you have to live with it.
It's an extraordinary story. I've worked with some organizations in advisory capacity who are really trying to focus on shaping or reshaping or rededicating themselves to their values and creating an ethical culture. And one of the biggest obstacles is when senior leadership doesn't stand up to the high performer, the rainmaker, who's a jerk, and treats people like trash, probably abuses half the policies, whether it's the obvious expense things or others, and to have the courage to look someone in the eye and say, you either buy into this way or not. And that's a big deal.
And I think, if you look at a lot of the problems on Wall Street, it's happened because people haven't stood up to the money makers. One other interesting thing, and I just thought of this, but it actually popped in my mind this morning, and I don't know why, but it fit exactly into your Wall Street Journal story, so I'll tell it, and it ties into Africa. There was a businessman that taught at the college also, probably in his 70s, had been a very successful businessman, had started 2 or 3 banks, sold them, and decided to go to Africa. I'd never met anybody, and to this day I've probably never met anybody like this guy. I've never met anybody so happy, so energetic, And, here I am, a 20-year-old kid, so I finally pulled him aside one day, and I said, kind of, what's the deal? What is it? Yeah, what makes you tick? And we started talking. And he said something that, this popped into my mind this morning, which is kind of interesting and challenged me, so I'll tell you. But he said, I started out in business, and I got up every morning. I read the entire Wall Street Journal before I walked into the office. I walked into every meeting prepared. I did my homework. I was ready. And he said, one day it clicked that I wasn't ready for life. I believed in the Bible as a Christian, but I wasn't ready for life, and I was spending my time with God, so I decided I'm going to get up an hour earlier. And so wasn't a commuter, so I didn't have to get up early, but got up, I think, 4:30 or 5 o'clock every morning. Wow. Read his Bible and prayed for an hour. And he said, I have to do that to prepare for life. Why shouldn't I spend as much time preparing for life as I do for work? And I've never seen anybody, to this day, I've not seen anybody like that. And I don't spend, I wish I could say I did that every day, that much time. But it was challenging to me this morning, and I think it kind of fits in with the journal.
Yeah, the phrase preparing for life is a whole different framing, isn't it? It's a whole different framing. That makes me think, you told a story last night we were sharing, your mom passed away recently, which, again, condolences. But would you mind sharing, I know it's a personal story, but sharing your uncle and your mom, because that to me fits with this life story theme.
Sure. Well, my mom passed away last January, and her only sibling, her brother, came about 2 weeks before, and we were in the hospital together, and it really hit me seeing the two of them together. He was what you would have called very successful 20 years ago, undergraduate degree and law degree from Harvard, probably 8 to 10 postgraduate degrees, very successful lawyer, very successful entrepreneur into real estate in Florida in the 70s, 80s, 90s, did very well. I would say he lived for 2 things: money and partying.
Money and partying.
And just fun. Life is fun, and making money, and that's really it. And it was interesting because if you look at my father taught in a college in Africa. He was a pastor for a while in the U.S. And she took care of us. But it was interesting because in the hospital, she was in 3 different units in the hospital in 3 weeks. By the time we hit the 3rd week, she had people, nurses coming from the other units on their off days to visit her. One even made the entire family dinner and brought it to the hospital. But here she was having an influence the weeks that she's dying to people, and people were flying in to see her, and the whole family was there. And he said to me, my uncle was sitting there, and he said to me, he basically lost everything in 2008. And he said, the only friends are the people I pay. And, you look at that and you think of, okay, what are we aiming for? And one of the questions I've asked myself is, what do you want people to say when you're 80 years old, at your 80th birthday? That was a great picture to me of, probably most of the people I work with and most people I know are aiming towards the things that my uncle was aiming towards, and to see the difference, at that age, at that point in the hospital, and to quite honestly see, I think his regret was very interesting.
It sounds like your mother, even as she was losing her life, her mortal life, was beginning to give him a life.
Oh, there's no doubt. She asked him to come up specifically so she could spend time with him and tell him about, one last time about her faith.
And thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's an amazing story, and what a contrast as a young boy growing up, sort of mom, uncle, trying to figure out which path you're going to go. And was sort of the path as far as your faith life one that was always sort of part of your wiring, or did you reject it for a period of time and do your own thing? Is it sort of linear or a powerful moment? If you don't mind sharing.
I probably rejected it for a while when I was young, and
you won't be the first one in this room to have done that. But
I think for me the thing was, and it scares me to say this because it scares me that I know I'm not perfect. But with my dad being a pastor, I basically looked at the people in the church and said they're a bunch of hypocrites, and I don't want to be like them.
Wow.
And because I could see, I saw stuff that other people didn't see. And so, it was this decision of I'm not gonna say one thing and do another. And growing up, so if I can't say it, if I don't think I can live it all the time, then I'm just not gonna. It's not gonna, And so I would say rejected it through college, and it was really when I went to Africa probably. That kind of turned me around, and that was probably that moment of that. But I think that even then it was this struggle of how do you, I always had this early on the struggle of, how do you integrate and how do you make sure that it's one thing to go to church on Sunday or to meet with a group of guys, but it's another thing to live it out at work.
That's, I think, one of the reasons that we come here month in and month out. What does it mean wherever we are and whatever we believe? How do we tap into that depth and integrate it as opposed to just parking it and saving it for the Sabbath? As you reflect on that process you've gone through, any stories or suggestions of ways you've sort of intentionally tried to integrate it?
I think... But I had a real challenge, and I think I mentioned, I was telling you some stories last night. I had a challenge where I remember sitting down with a pastor when I was young that I was friends with, and I started my career, and we were talking, and I said, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll work till I'm 50, and I'll retire, and then I'll go work for a not-for-profit. And he looked at me and he said, basically what you're saying is you want to do it all yourself, and you don't want to trust God, and you want to make the money, and you want to be comfortable, and then you'll go help God. And he challenged me. He said, you need to think about how do you integrate your faith into everything you do. It can't be compartmentalized. And that was a real challenge to me. Of yeah, you're right. It was a little bit all about me.
Yeah. I think a lot of folks in this room have thought about that. Gee, if I can only get to that nut, that magic number. And in fact, there was an op-ed piece back in I think around 2001, sort of the go-go heady.com days. And what some people were calling it is a little bit, they were calling it the FU number. The number at which they could walk away and say, I'm done, I'm out of here. And what a kind of a sad thought when you think about it. And one of the things we struggle with is how can in and through our work, with all of its pressures, with all of its difficulties, with all of its challenges and occasional highs and joys, how can that be a place of flourishing ministry, which doesn't mean running around and trying to convert everybody you work with. It's living a certain kind of a life, isn't it? Yeah. Some of you might have read that we're talking also about the book Halftime that Bob Buford wrote that's changed many people's lives. And sort of the theory of the book is that you get, sort of using a sporting metaphor, you get to halftime, recalibrate, how do I want to play the second half of my life? And for a lot of people, including the author, you have a liquidity event and you check out and then you spend the rest of your time doing philanthropy, which is a great model for a small percentage of the population. What we were talking about is, but for most people, that's not the right model. That's not the right model.
No, and in fact, I think probably if there's a new version of Halftime that's come out, the book that changes that a bit. And in fact, I was with Lloyd Reed, who wrote Success to Significance, and is probably Buford's main guy who lives in Charlotte, and I've done some things with him recently. And when we got together for the first time, we were talking about, passions and focus. He's real about passions and focus, and what do you want to accomplish in the next 30 years, particularly when you hit, mid 40s, 50s, 60s. You have this life. What do you want to do? To me, it was don't leave. He immediately said, don't leave. This isn't about leaving your job, because your job may be your platform, and that may be your ministry and your mission field, and don't leave your job. And so, I think it has changed some. I do think, though, that to me we need, and I told you this last night, I think we need Christians in the workplace, and particularly in business. And you look at the issues that, call it Wall Street or large banks or financial institutions in general are facing right now, and we need nothing more than having Christians that are excellent at what they do in the workplace. And I think to take people out is not always the right thing. I think the other thing that I'm finding, and I've spent some time with, and I love what you're doing with the younger generation. But
tell us a bit what you're doing in Charlotte.
I've just over the years in spending time with kind of the 25 to 35, one of the things I've noticed is they're asking the questions that a lot of us are asking as we hit our 40s and 50s is, how do I have significance in the workplace? How do I have balance? How do I make a difference? How do I excel at work but do all this? And so I think that's something that is become a passion for me. And I've started a group with a friend of mine that runs a commercial real estate firm, and we have a group of about 10 guys that we've just been meeting for about 8 weeks, but we pull together, and it's a wide range of guys, but just it's really how do you live out your faith, and how do you balance, and how do you excel at work, and and be excellent at what you do, but do that and live out your faith, and I think that it's extremely important.
I had a professor once when I left the workplace and was studying theology for a few years, and he made the comment that the doctrine of sin is rather democratically spread around the population. Meaning, whether you're a Christian, a Jew, an atheist, that no one has a perfect bulletproof vest, or as St. Paul would say, we do that which we know we ought not to do. In other words, we screw up sometimes. Can you think of any stories in your life as you look back where you wish you could have a mulligan, you wish you could have a do-over, where in hindsight you didn't play that in a way that would make your faith proud or looking in the mirror?
I would say yes. I don't know.
So, and which one do you want me to talk about?
I don't know if I do want to talk about it. I could tell you a number of things, and whether it be, spending time. I think that relationships are extremely important, and one of the things that. I sat down with my wife probably a year and a half ago. We had a friend that was getting a divorce, and I started talking about the last 4 years for me were really crazy. And I asked Becky, I said, okay, so how did I do with family in that time? And she said, well, you did good with family, and you've done good at work, but you've given everything else up. And so it really caused me to rethink and think of the need to be intentional and intentional in relationships. And
here you're talking about friendships, right?
I'm talking about friendships.
So if you have the circle of family, the circle of work, you're talking about a third circle.
I think it's a combination, and I think it's I think that it's the circle, your family, then the circle of friends that you're close with, that I think is incredibly important. And then I think it's even relationships in a work environment. And I think if you sit down and you think of the story about my mother, you think about if you sit down and you actually do the exercise of, okay, what do I want people to say about me when I'm 80? And you're really honest with yourself, a lot of it is around relationships. And, if you give that up completely, that's it's not good. And so that's an area. And then I think there's been times, and I mentioned this to you, I think there's times when, I think one of the biggest struggles to me is the balance between, and it's not, I call it not ethical issues that are black and white, but
the gray zone.
Gray zone of or call it more around transparency, and when legally, if everything ethically is you don't have to say anything, and you don't. And I think that's an area that I've really spent a lot of time thinking about, and I've made mistakes at times. But I think that it's the thing that I've really thought through is, in the end, whether it be my dealings with management growing up in the bank, or whether it be with clients, or whether it be with regulators, is there's a piece of trust there, and you don't want to lose that trust. If you lose the trust, you basically, to me, have lost everything, and you've lost your witness, you've lost. And so, to me, you do have to sit down and say, okay, what is really the right thing to do, and how do I be transparent? How do I make sure that you don't lose that level of trust? And I think it's incredibly important in this day and age. And I think and you've seen it over and over when people have not been as transparent, and sometimes it is gray, and it comes back
And sometimes young professionals will say, well, that's easy for you to say, Mark, because you're at the top of the pyramid. You've got the job that we all dream about. Or maybe not, because it's a pretty tough job. But you know what I'm saying, that you have a certain power and authority, so you can talk about being transparent. You could talk about being more forthcoming. I'm a young analyst, or I'm a young account rep, and I'm just trying to make my numbers. I don't have time for this. I've got to do whatever I've got to do to get it done, because I'm under so much heat to make my numbers. How would you respond to that?
Look, I think that if you... talking, and I'll give you a couple of examples, but talking from a pure transparency, I don't think you have a choice. I think if you start heading into the gray zone, and you can't compromise. I would say you can't compromise. And for a bank, I've studied banks a lot, but in my last job as treasurer, around the liquidity of a bank, it's all about trust, right? If people lose trust in the bank, the liquidity goes. And it's the same thing in our personal lives. And I think that you can't compromise. Yeah. And I think there's times where, whether it be that, or whether it be, hours worked, where I've actually, even younger in my career, where I actually drew a line, and not always, but I'll give you an example. I moved to London, and I knew that in London, the culture was, well, I like getting in early to work, and typically people don't get in real early there, but I like getting in early, so I would get in real early, and typically what people would do is they'd work into the night because of the U.S. hours, and so I would get in early, work with the Asia team. I'd work during the day, and before I left, I told my boss, I said, okay, I'll do the job, but realize that on nights where I'm not traveling or have a dinner, I'm leaving at 6, and I'll go home. I had 3 young girls at the time, and I said, I'm leaving at 6. I'll eat dinner with them. They all are in bed by 7:30 or 8, and if I have to work from 8 till 12, I'll work from 8 till 12, but realize 6 to 8, I'm going to do it, and I'm not going to be in the office. So I want you to know that up front, and it worked fine. But, I think sometimes you have to and it was tough, and it was, a time in my career that could have backfired. But I think sometimes you have to sit down and lay down there.
So in a way, you're creating a narrative of who you are in the organization. In fact, I remember, where's Hank? I remember talking about Hank once spoke to some of my students when I was teaching at Yale at this Christian MBA conference, and one of the students sort of posed that same question. And I'll never forget Hank's answer. No, you are creating what you're going to be known for.
Yeah.
And do you want to be known as the person who plays in the gray zone and, okay, maybe you get a deal here or there, but then your whole reputation is tainted. That you have to start practicing even when you might pay for it early on. So, you shared with Becky that story when you did a little audit check. How'd I do these past few years? Wasn't it Mayor Koch? How am I doing, right? So, you also shared another story, if you don't mind sharing, when you had just come back from a really, really intense period of time when 2008 was all blowing up. I think you'd been traveling for a couple months, and you came home one evening, and what happened?
Yeah, I'm lucky I have a wife who will tell me when she's frustrated at me or when I do something wrong.
I wonder if we have the same wife, by the way. I love you, Karen. I love you. I'm just kidding.
I think it's, and I actually tell these young guys I meet with, I think it's important to have that communication, because if they don't tell you, it can end up blowing up 10 years later. But we were living in London. The crisis, this was early 2008, the crisis was, you were having the cracks, and I got asked to move here. We moved actually to Greenwich for a year, and I started commuting back and forth, and so for about 7 months I commuted London to New York. And it was pretty intense, and I was working long hours, and I was a little
gone. British understatement, a little intense.
It was, and I would, sometimes I do a week on and a few days back in the London office, and some days I do 2 weeks, and I happened to be gone for 2 weeks, and I flew in on a Friday, got in about 2:30 to the house. The kids got out at 2:45. I walked down to the school with Becky, picked the girls up at school, the two younger ones, and gave them a hug, and within 30 seconds my phone rings, and it would work. And the whole way home I talked on the phone. And I got to the house and hung up, and I thought I had done a great thing by going to the kids' school and picking them up. And my wife said, what do you think you just taught them? You've been gone for 2 weeks. You give them a hug, and your phone rings, and you can't tell somebody you'll call them back in 15 minutes when they get home. And you just taught them that your work is way more important than they are. And it was a very, very valuable lesson.
I think many of us, myself included, are convicted by that story. I shared that with Karen last night when I got back to the Murphys where I was staying, and she said, that's a story you need to take to heart. I've done that myself. In a few minutes we'll open up to questions that anyone might have. We'll have a sort of a group conversation. But I wanted to go back to thinking about when you're at work. Do you think people know you're a Christian, a person of faith? Do you have sort of posters all over your wall, honk if you love Jesus, or?
No. I try to, I try to take, you and I talked a little about this, I think, I try to take opportunities if I have an opportunity. So, give an example. If I'm back at the office in an hour from now and get asked what were you doing this morning, I'll take the opportunity to tell people, and sometimes it leaves a chance to talk about faith and not. The most interesting thing to me is that,
just to pick up on, if I may, as we were chatting about this, it's amazing how just the casual phrase or sentence, so I was giving a talk at Greenwich Leadership. What's that? Oh, it's a group of people who are trying to connect. This crazy guy stands up with a Bible and the Wall Street Journal, and we were talking about these issues. Or Monday morning you see someone at the office, hey, did you have a good weekend? What'd you do? Yeah, well, Chuck preached a really good sermon this weekend, and it really helped me think about work. And suddenly you have, some people may walk away, but other people might say, really, that's kind of interesting, tell me more.
Yeah. And the most interesting thing is when you say something to somebody, or sometimes you don't even say something, and years later it comes back. And
have you ever had one of those?
And somebody asks you, and I had an interesting one. This was a few years ago, but you're typical trader, great friend, just
shy, bashful, reclining, low-key?
Not at all. And he worked for me, and we had somebody in our broader group who had committed suicide, and so we were talking one morning, and he was talking about how the stress that people were under, and he said, you look at this person and they look like they've aged 10 years, and you look at this person and they look like, and he was just going down the line, and he said, you're the only one that seems calm and doesn't look like they've aged. And he said, do you know why? And so I figured I'd ask him why, and I said, no, why? And I figured I was going to get a real smart aleck answer. And he said, because you're the only one in the group that has a faith. And I don't know if I've ever talked to him about faith. And he said, I know enough about the Bible that it takes as much faith not to believe as to believe. And you believe, and you have a faith that guides you, and that that helps you through these times. And he said, I'm not there, but I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to let you take me out to dinner and try to evangelize me. It was an interesting conversation, and I've had several of those where people come up to you and ask you those questions. Where this particular person, I don't remember ever having a conversation with him about my faith, so.
John Tyson, who's visited us here once, a good friend from Tyson Foods, he says that this whole thing of living out our faith at work, it's not about promotion, it's about attraction. Mm-hmm. It's how we live our life, which goes back to that story when you were a PK over in Africa and you watched all the hypocrites in the community, in the church. You were sharing another story that didn't someone fairly recently ask you, is it even possible to be a Christian at a senior level?
Yeah, I had somebody recently came up and said that he had somebody that worked for him that wanted to get together with me, and that would I have a cup of coffee with him, because he said, I'm glad that I've heard Mark is a Christian, I'm glad he's a Christian, but how can somebody be a Christian at your level? And I think that's and what the decisions you're having to make, and I guess what it shows me is exactly the same as the last story. People are watching,
people are watching,
and again, it goes to even the gray areas. I mean, in every area of your life, people are watching.
I want to raise the helicopter for a minute and talk about a big question. The financial sector, since 2008, has really taken a beating, and in some ways very deservedly so, and in some ways probably undeservedly. But and not Bank of America, but in general, the banking sector. There's the Occupy Wall Street movement, or in London they call it Occupy St. Paul's. A lot of young professionals are trying to figure, should I go into this field? Is it all corrupt? Is it broken? All I'm doing is moving around one bucket of money to another bucket of money to help one rich person, help another rich person. I want to do social justice. I want to change the world. And would Jesus really be proud of me going to be an analyst at one of the top firms like that and doing that? How do you think about banking writ large is it a calling? Can it be a calling, a vocation? And if so, what are the dimensions of it that you see help make the world a better place?
I definitely think it. I mean, I feel it's a calling for me, and I feel like it can be. I've actually thought through this quite a bit, and the need. I mean, if you just step back and you think of the need for financial institutions, I've become real involved in microfinance, and think of that as banking, particularly loans, but banking for the poorest of the poor, kind of, and a lot of times people that don't make under $2 a day, and the interesting thing is, if you look in a lot of the countries, look at countries in Africa, for instance, I mean, if you don't have access to capital or to a loan, you can't send your kids to school. A lot of countries, they charge for schools. In a lot of countries, actually, they charge interest to keep your money safe, because your choice is you either leave it in your house in a jar or you give it to somebody because you don't have enough money to put it in a Barclays or a Standard Chartered or one of the banks that's in your town.
So you get a negative interest just to make sure it's safe.
You get a negative interest, and so you think of the good that a bank creates. And so, to me, I've sat back and I've thought about the reasons for banks and even the reasons for large banks, and there is a reason, and I think it's part of the opportunity that we all have is because of financial institutions. I think the other thing that I've really thought through is that it's to me that's an opportunity for the world, and then as a Christian, there are opportunities, even the money that we make and the ability to give and different things. But to me, there are a number of reasons why it's a calling. But one is I think there is a real reason for there's a reason for banks, and I think that you're going to have financial institutions and to have people that are. I think it's a huge need. I mentioned before to have people that are Christian, that are ethical, that are living out their faith at work, and to be honest with you, that are doing excellent at their work, and is really key, and we need that.
If you dial back the history, go back to, let's say not just 2008, but sort of 2005 to 2008, and a lot of things went on in the mortgage space and other things. What are things, if you could have been king and waved a magic wand, what do you wish certain certain bankers might have done to prevent, stop, call the questions about practices that we now look back at with some embarrassment that went on in the banking sector?
I think there's a couple issues. I think there's the pure ethical, issues which you see in the newspapers every day. I was mentioning to you by Lloyd Reeb, who I mentioned before, told me to try something. He said, I want you to read the journal and then cut out the articles that make you angry, and to look at where your passions are. And it was fascinating because all the articles that made me angry were basically financial institution fraud, whether it be the FX scandals that we're talking about now, the LIBOR scandals, but it's taking something that is good and something that adds value and perverting it, and so that really, there's that piece that really upsets me, and it's still happening, and it happened then, and I think that's frustrating. I think there's a lot of lessons learned. That whether from a risk management side, I could tell you lesson after lesson that we've learned. And
what would one or two be of those lessons?
I think one to me that is important is I think people looked at probability, and they multiplied probability of something happening by an amount, and if the probability was tiny, let's give an example. Let's say you said that the probability of losing money or the probability of the entire housing market in the U.S. going down is,
0.
tiny,
whatever,
and yet your risk is $20 billion if it does, or it will put you out of business. They kind of multiplied the probability by the dollar amount, thus it was a tiny dollar amount.
Oh, right.
Well, it's digital. You either lose the money or you don't. And when it went wrong, you couldn't afford to lose the $20 billion. And I think that if you look across people's assumptions on the housing markets in the U.S., if you look at structured products in 2008, that people, all the assumptions were that your probability is tiny. And so, to me, that was a big, I think that was a big mistake that Wall Street firms made, and mortgage companies made.
Let me ask you one more question, then we'll open up what might be in people's minds, and that's the more senior one becomes in an organization, the harder it is to find truth tellers. There's a lot of people who are sycophants. They'll tell you what you want to hear. They won't challenge you. If they think you're dead wrong in something, they'll either keep their mouth shut or say, that's a great idea, boss. I'm with you. How do you deal with that phenomena of are people telling you the truth around you?
I think the most important thing to me is to have, and this is something that I feel like I gave up for a while, and I said I think that was a big mistake,
right.
but it is relationships with people that will hold you accountable and will tell you what they think. Mike Stollard and I have been close friends for years. Mitch and Mike and I met when I lived in Greenwich every Saturday morning. But to have somebody like Mike that I can call up and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this, does it make sense? I have one other friend who's an entrepreneur, a very close friend, and I can call him up and he will tell me what he thinks. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. I mean, it is, you're being an idiot, Mark, and you need people in your life that are truth tellers, and you need people who will hold you accountable. You need people that you can go to, and you need relationships. And I think that it's extremely dangerous to not have that. And I think that if you look at, my view is, having looked at a lot of the problems in the last few years, in the last 20 years, I think as in senior management, it can be very isolating, and people don't tell you the truth, and people want to please you, and people treat you a certain way because you have a job, and I think it's very dangerous to live like that, and it's very dangerous to not have a group of people and that you can go to and to isolate yourself.
It's an important word, I think, isolation, because it's not that you're necessarily trying to isolate, but the position almost dictates it. There was, we had Greg Page, the chairman of Cargill, come and talk once, and he made the same point, how do you not stay isolated? And he had what he called mirrors. He had 14 mirrors in his life. He knew them all by name. Some were inside the business, some were outside, some were ones he went through the training program with, people who, if he gave a town hall or a meeting afterwards, and kind of how'd I do it? And they would say, that stunk. And here's why. You're coming across as pompous now, or you're whatever it might be. And he took that actually from the book of James. I can't remember where it is, but there's this sense of being surrounded by mirrors, by truth tellers. It's an important part of it.
It's extremely important.
Yeah. Terrific. That's a wonderful way to end. How about a round of applause to thank